So I wonder to what extent Bitcoin actually undermines the entire paradigm that we built ourselves on.
That's so cool. I don't know if you meant this, but you said we could reinterpret the Genesis story of the state. And I would say we reinterpret the Genesis story of the state with the Exodus story of the Bible. Okay? And I'm not a particularly religious man, but I do think the Exodus story is one of the greatest ever told by any human being. And it's this idea of liberation through exit.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's Wolf NYC, WOLFNYC.com.
Max Borders, welcome to the What is Money Show.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, man, really looking forward to this conversation. I appreciate your patience getting this thing scheduled. I know we had a little bit of back and forth, but I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. And just by way of quick introduction, you're the author of several books. Most recently, you've written the book Underthrow, and then your most popular book is titled The Social Singularity. So I guess to start, maybe we could talk about Underthrow a little bit. Now, when we first started talking about this, I didn't realize Underthrow was kind of like the counterpoint to Overthrow.
Right.
So there's a thematic element there, I guess, in the title of the book. And you've described it as like a futurist way of tapping into American patriotism. Could you tell me?
I think that's fair.
Could you tell me a little bit about what that means and why you chose that title in particular?
Sure, yeah. I mean, really, there's an excellent writer and friend of mine, Michael Gibson, who came up with the term. He sort of coined the term in the context of an article called The Nakamoto Consensus, which is a great article. I suggest anybody, check that out. But really, this idea of people contracting with each other, through consensual relationships would somehow bring down power one agreement at a time. And that really stuck out to me. So when you think about it in those terms, really it becomes, as you said, sort of the inversion of overthrow. So if you think about the French Revolution, say, the French Revolution is a violent overthrow. With underthrow, you can use subversive innovation, cultural change, and all sorts of other vectors of change that are peaceful. And that emphasis on peaceful means it's underthrow. So Gandhi in the 1940s, bringing down the British Raj, did so through peaceful means, and that's really what Underthrow is all about in that title.
That's really cool. Yeah. So was it Gandhi was collecting salt by the seashore or something like that when there was a tax on salt. So, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't that part of the protest he was doing? That he was just collecting salt peacefully, whereas the British were trying to tax people on the production of salt, something like that.
Well, that's an interesting. That's the idea that something like that catalyzed the whole movement is really interesting. It's reminiscent of the American Revolution, which whether and to what extent you would call that overthrow or underthrow, I couldn't say. There was certainly a war and a revolution came of it. I'm sure they hoped it would be peaceful, but the redcoats had other things in mind. But in terms of Gandhi, this that there was this catalyzing event is really interesting to consider. And I wonder if overthrow is going to require a catalyzing event too. Underthrow. But Gandhi's sort of cultivating this idea of satyagraha in people, satya being truth and graha being forcefulness. So truth force. You're telling a moral truth over and over again that allows you to bring down power because it enjoys popular support. And that is another mechanism of underthrow I think is quite promising.
That's very interesting. So what was the term? Truth power?
Yeah, truth force, I think, is one way of interpreting it. Satyagraha.
Satya, yeah. I've heard people talk about, the denomination of Bitcoin is called sats. And we look up the word sat in Sanskrit. It means something like that, like a truth. Very powerful.
Yeah, that's right. Some integrity, truth, something like that. It's in fact, I think in the yamas of the Yoga Sutras, the yamas, it's the second. The first one is ahimsa, which is non, and himsa being violence. So non-violence and satya together are kind of my jam, and I think the jam of all Bitcoiners, if you think of it in those terms.
Yeah, I think it would be very fair to call Bitcoin a bloodless revolution of sorts, right? There's not an overthrowing of any particular power structure, but there's kind of an undermining of all political power structures in general, just by changing to a new incentive paradigm. And obviously on the point of integrity and truth, we often refer to Bitcoin as corresponding to these things, right? Like Bitcoin, in terms of integrity, well, Bitcoin only does what it says it will do, right? That's basically the only operation of the entire system. And then obviously it's true in the sense that the transaction history is unalterable and changeable and arguable, and it is open for all to see, right? I think it was Heidegger that he described truth as unconcealedness, which was, I think, derived from the term aletheia from the ancient Greeks, which just meant something that's totally uncovered, effectively, unconcealedness. And that's what Bitcoin is, right? It's just this unconcealed open source software. There's nothing to hide, nothing you can hide inside of the system. And it's amazing how subversive that is to political power overall. Do you consider Bitcoin as like part of, do you consider it to be a subversive innovation? And then if so, is it part of the underthrow kind of thesis?
Absolutely. It is probably the pinnacle of subversive innovation. And Satoshi being the exemplar of subversive innovation, they, he, she, whoever they were. And in addition, some of the people who, if not were Satoshi, certainly informed the paradigm, people like Nick Szabo and Hal Finney, they're subversive innovators. I mean, they are the paradigmatic examples of that, even more than someone like Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. I mean, I consider that a subversive innovation too, because you had these taxi medallion cartels right? And no one thought those could ever be upended because they were government established monopolies. But you had this legal gray area in which a subversive innovator could operate, and brought together some existing technologies, GPS, reputation systems. All of it was stuff that we already had. But Kalanick saw that you make ideas have sex, and created the Uber technology. And boy, did it ever work. I mean, certainly Uber is not a perfect company. It's not a perfectly decentralized system like something like a Bitcoin is, but it is an example of a constant, the way the market process creates iteration cycles and around, particularly in the going into the headwinds of state power. And that was just one little example with Uber. But absolutely, I mean, Bitcoin is, to me, almost the apotheosis of subversive innovation.
Yeah, that's a great point. The combining of already existing technologies to create something novel. That obviously Bitcoin was created in the same way. The Gutenberg printing press was created in the same way. And that idea of ideas reproducing, procreating, I love that. I think I saw that originally with Matt Ridley's The Rational Optimist.
Absolutely. It's just such a fantastic book. I mean, Ridley is a hero of mine. I mean, even sort of being able to step back from that meta perspective that he takes on, is a species of subversive innovation. Now, that's some people are just, they're mavens. They like to write and think and talk, and I'm one of them. I wish I were more of an active innovator like a Satoshi, but certainly the idea, like almost like my mission is in life is, if I can do nothing else but spawn 1,000 more Satoshis, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. So I guess this is kind of a good segue into this idea of self-government. I don't know if you talk about this in Underthrow or some of your other books, but moving towards this ideal of individuals being, more self-governing, let's say. So less political power being imposed to organize society, and more of a bottom-up approach. And I think you've used the terms anarchy versus panarchy in this area. And so I guess if we could define those terms, anarchy and panarchy, and then to what extent are Bitcoiners emblematic of this ideal of self-governance?
Sure. Wow. Okay. Great cluster questions together. So don't let me drop any of them, because I really want to address all of those. Let me step back first and sort of contextualize the discussion, maybe for people who are more classical libertarian types. You'll often hear people in sort of competing theoretical camps fight about whether and to what extent we should have minarchy, which is the idea of a minimal state that is nevertheless a monopoly, and then market anarchism, or anarcho-capitalism, if you like, which is more of a competitive version, a non-monopolistic version of that. And I have to say, over the course of my life and the cultivation of my own thinking, I've passed more from a theoretical standpoint from minarchy to anarcho-capitalism or market anarchism. But one day I had a sort of moment, a realization, and I started calling myself an asymptotic anarchist. Okay. And that sounds like a funny term, but and by the way, I'm terrible at math. So people who are the math heads out there, like your Bitcoin devs or whoever, the people that are good at math may make fun of me. But as I understand it, an asymptote is a curve, and you're a math guy too, because you come from a finance background. So please disabuse me of this ridiculous notion if it's bad. But as I understand it, an asymptote is a curve that approaches a line or an axis and never actually quite meets it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's okay. So the idea there is, it's a metaphorical way of describing, like, okay, we may never get to a condition of anarchy, which the moral substrate of that relationships, all peaceful and harmonious relationships, no compulsion. So the elimination of compulsion would be fully realized in an anarchic state of affairs, but we may never actually get there. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're going to ever have some great constitutional moment, at least not in our lifetimes, like they did in 1789 or something like that. And even then, the Constitution was imposed, and we can get back to that in a moment. It wasn't consensual; it was imposed. Nevertheless, I always think of it in these terms. There's never going to be a theoretical instantiation that becomes actualized. We're always going to be situated in what Hayek called the circumstances of time and place, with Leviathan powers, with mafias, with criminal elements, with all manner of groups that are trying to vie for power. So what we're always trying to do is simultaneously is conquer the mind. So we want to swear off the threat of violence and begin to conquer. Conquest is perhaps not the best term, because I really want to emphasize this idea of satyagraha, of sort of existing in truth and exuding it, and that includes species of moral truth. But eventually we get to a place where people see the beautiful flourishing and harmony that comes out of establishing consensual relationships. And slowly over time, we can use subversive innovation to gain rapid constituency groups around certain kinds of technologies, say, like Bitcoin. Bitcoin was able to attract, through both incentives and through a kind of moral North Star, people to its system. And I don't want us to forget that it wasn't always about just money. It was also about morality. And I think you would agree with that. So certainly the incentives matter, but so also does the moral substrate that has the moral core that informs the Satoshi white paper. I mean, if you go back and read the work of Nick Szabo, for example, you'll see so much of this beautifully sort of morally informed cypherpunk considerations. The kind of law that he sought to embrace, it was about reconciling frictions, say, with common law, and how that's at odds with Justinian law, which is imposed law of statutes, wise men imposing statutes on people. It's a very different species of law, but you can see in Szabo's writing and that of the other cypherpunks, this moral core. And so in any case, this idea of asymptotic anarchy is just about being realistic about what we're dealing with. We're always having to confront, circumvent, or otherwise address power. So you could think of it as like bees versus bears, right? We decentralists, as I like to call people who are into Bitcoin and other decentralizing technologies, believe in the power of truth and consensual relationships. And so we come out together as a hive mind and sort of attack the bear, which is sort of symbolic of Leviathan power.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I guess before I give you some feedback on that, can you rope in the term panarchy?
Oh yeah, yep. Thank you.
What that means in the context of what you're saying here?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to interpret panarchy, but I think panarchy is panarchy and anarchy are in some sense reconcilable. Okay, because each is at its foundation based on choice. Panarchy has a pragmatic element, though. So let's say you and I decide, that we want to go off and live in a hippie commune or a kibbutz or something. We convert to Judaism and we want to go to Israel and join a kibbutz. Okay. And conversion to Judaism, all the Jews are out there laughing. It's like, we don't do that. But anyway, Yeah, you can ask the rabbi 3 or 4 times, and sometimes they'll accept you. But we go off and we join a kibbutz, right? And what we know about kibbutz is that it's highly redistributive, okay? So if we accept through consent, through a multilateral contract, the idea of joining this kibbutz, then we agree to give up, 75% of our income to put towards the good of the kibbutz. Now, people might say, "Oh, that's just commie crap," right? But the fact is, there are a lot of people out there. Pluralism is both. There is a factual pluralism, positive pluralism. People are different from one to the next out there. And so people are going to have different moral, political sensibilities. And so Panarchy really acknowledges that, but it puts choice first. So if you want to opt into a situation whereby you want to join a kibbutz or form a little Iceland or looks like Sweden or something like that, you can do that, but you're doing that contractually. You're doing that first through consent, and you're being respected as an agent in doing so first. Panarchy acknowledges that and seeks to create a kind of framework or superstructure. Some of your readers might like Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Part 2 of that book is the most famous part. It's about how and why redistribution is unjust and, this and that. But part 3 is really interesting in that it seeks to accommodate these different conceptions of the good for moral political structures. It doesn't assume just a checklist of how things can work. So Panarchy could be, if you really think about it, a species of anarchy. But it really seeks to enable, through legal means, people to create and opt into different kinds of moral political communities, some of which will be communal, some of which will be religious, some of which will be capitalist, or hybrids of all of these. And so if you think of that as embedded in basic law, in some say actual social contract, the largest or sort of superordinate social contract would be one that spawns these jurisdictions or membership clubs, if you like, or civil associations that each of us can enter. We can all have our own moral political structures and systems, and they have to be tested through sustainability, right? It's like you can't impose them on anybody else. You have to use what Deirdre McCloskey calls sweet talk and beckon them to come into your social order. Right. And if you can't, well, then you fail. And so it's a Darwinian system in that regard, but you can't impose it. So that's the difference between panarchy and anarchy.
Yeah, that has a lot of, it sounds like it's characterized closely with what we would consider in just free market competition, right? That producers of goods and services can't impose, like a car dealer can't beat you over the head to buy his car. He has to make you a good deal and sweet talk you, as you say, and, talk you into it, persuade you. And that's pretty much a clear moral intuition for us in every industry in the world. But for some reason, when it comes to statism, I guess just because of the nature of what it is, right? It's the monopolist on force that we somehow we fail to see how using that force to then forcefully onboard customers or prevent customers from exiting, as in the case of the US, we have the exit tax, for instance. If you decide the service you're being provided is not up to snuff or you're being overcharged and want to leave, well, you get taxed. For some reason, our moral intuitions don't apply to the industry of statism as they do with other industries. And so, I don't know, I've thought it's a very kind of pernicious problem. And I wonder if it is just like, as you said, we're inhabitants of physical reality. So we always have to concern ourselves with the realities of physical power and, the threat of physical power being wielded against us. So we mobilize this giant monopoly on power called the state. But it seems like the temptation for people inside of the state to bend that apparatus to their own gain is almost wholly irresistible, right? And that seems like the recurrent pattern across history is we vested in an institution with absolute power, and as Lord Acton said, it corrupts absolutely. And we're constantly trying to figure out how can we keep the peace, yet not vest absolute power in this institution that inevitably becomes corrupt over time, and then obviously collapses as a result of that corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm probably a bit older than you. I'm certain of it. But we both share, probably throughout school, being taught that monopolies were bad, right? That they have higher prices, lower quality, restricting choices, and we gotta bust the trust, right? We gotta bust these trusts, which are monopolies.
Yeah.
And so we ended up trusting these authoritarian powers who claim they're going to be angels, and we know they're no angels. And so the corruption process, it's like once you have the power, once you have the ring, very much like Frodo or Bilbo, you have to resist its temptation. And over time, people can't, particularly in representative democracies where you get sort of these perverse or unholy alliances between corporations and governments that create, and sorry to use the F word on your show, but a species of fascism.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have, because people throw around the term fascism all the time, and they just don't know what it means. But it really, literally, if you listen to Mussolini, he describes it very, very distinctly as the marriage of corporation and state.
Yes,
subordinating corporations to state ends, right. And of course, states are nothing but hypostatization, which is like. States are just an aggregation of people, individual people, lording power over other people. Mm-hmm. Back in the agricultural, not the agricultural revolution, but in the early agrarian societies, mm-hmm. right? When humanity went from hunter-gatherer arrangements to settled agriculture because they figured out how to plant. You also had brigands who could figure out how to come and take your grain.
That's right.
And so this idea of a protection racket mm-hmm. is a very rational, it's almost Hobbesian in the way it comes across, mm-hmm. but it's almost like backing ourselves into Hobbesianism. So hungry brigands would come around and say, they're bigger, badder motherfuckers coming along, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to protect you from them in exchange and make you an offer you can't refuse. We're going to protect you, but you're going to give us a portion of your grain every couple of months.
Right.
And so it's a protection racket. Yeah. And that evolved into the great states mm-hmm. of the early agricultural period. That there's a great thinker named James C. Scott, who has a book called Against the Grain. He also has a book called 2 Cheers for Anarchism. And this idea of the protection racket, the rise of the state as protection racket. Of course, Hobbes came along after that and said, if you don't submit your ultimate freedom to a sovereign, life will be nasty, brutish, and short because you just fight with each other. But the truth is, we have incentives not to fight with each other and to coordinate, collaborate, and play the infinite game, not the zero-sum game. And politics, of course, is the zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great point. I wonder too, because when I think through these lines, I end up just running into the wall of incentives. Like people are essentially going to do whatever is profitable. So even when you're describing, we have these incentives to cooperate, right? Increase the division of labor, increase our productivity, increase aggregate wealth. But as aggregate wealth grows, aren't we simultaneously increasing the incentives for, I think you called them the boggans, the people that want to expropriate that wealth, right? The more wealth is actually being created, you're actually increasing the profitability of coercion in a way, right? especially if it's concentrated in one place. So I'm not so sure we can do much about that human nature, right? It's like if there's an opportunity to take it, someone's going to take it. So the best thing we can do is make wealth really hard, expensive, risky, difficult to take effectively. And we've tried, and we've done that to a large extent, right? We have the rule of law, and we have, anti-theft technologies, things like this. But it seems like that, especially at the state level, so long as that opportunity is there, someone's just always going to take it. And so and that makes sense to me, the way, like, the genesis of the state in the early agrarian society is like, okay, for the first time in history, we're settled, we're creating an economic surplus. Well, who's going to protect the surplus, right? I'm sure there's plenty of people that were still hunters and gatherers out there that saw, hey, there's a bunch of food in that shed over there, let's just go take it. So it makes sense you would have to create some type of protection racket. But then I started to wonder in my mind, like, what would it be like? So in that sense, the state is almost like a free market enterprise in a way. It's like you needed the protection. But then you get into this weird incentive trap where the protector sort of charges monopoly prices, right? It says, you're going to pay me what you're going to pay me, or I'm going to hurt you, or I'm not going to protect you. It's very mafioso, right?
It's exactly right. I mean, it's based in fear.
Yeah.
So it's rational to subordinate yourself or to submit to this power.
Yes.
It's absolutely rational. That's why it's an evolved system. Like, there is a sense in which we want to come back and say, well, this is all immoral. Mm-hmm. But there's an old saying, I think it's from Bertolt Brecht, the playwright. It's eat first, then ethics, right? So it's rational in the economic sense of like we got to live, and there are different means of living, and the biggest, baddest guy is going to come around. The brigand is going to come around and say, I'm going to make you a deal. Now, that is a form of consent, but it's consent under duress. So it's not the kind of consent I'm talking about or want to talk about.
Well, yeah, it's voluntary, but not consensual. I think this is the correct distinction, right? You're doing it voluntarily, but because there's a threat of force backing it, it's not actually consent. As if someone bugging you in the alley to take your wallet, like, you hand them your wallet voluntarily, but it's not consensual, obviously.
Well, and this is why we saw the rise of militia groups over in the intervening years, right? So remember and I just came up with the metaphor, so it's going to have its limits. I don't want to stretch them too far, but the idea of the bees versus the bear, right? The brigand is the bear. The brigand hierarchy is the bear. Mm-hmm. And we can have, what does distributed or decentralized defense look like? And we have to start thinking in those terms, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Because we'll easily degenerate into warlordism if we have some sort of, vast economic collapse or something, they're comparative leviathans. And so you can get bad outcomes. You can get lawless anarchy, which nobody wants. Mm-hmm. Because lawless anarchy definitely invites people to see who's the biggest, baddest leviathan and pits them into a contest of warlordism. We see that around the world to this day, those dynamics. Mm-hmm. Instead, if we can maintain a condition of relative prosperity and have people see the benefits of playing a positive sum game rather than a negative sum game, or the infinite game versus the finite game, that is the breakthrough. That is the breakthrough of people who grok Bitcoin.
Yes.
And that protects us, this idea of sovereignty around a moral core.
Yes. No.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, iCoin Technology. iCoin has just released a sleek new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone, a little touch screen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, no GPS. It's a strictly physically cold hardware wallet. Like I said, it's got a high-res 3-inch touch screen. It's got a camera for air gapping the wallet. It's got optional Bluetooth compatibility, and it's really a brand new UI UX experience for a hardware wallet, making it very accessible, easy to use, not intimidating. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like iCoin Wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. Go to iCointechnology.com today and use promo code Bitcoin23 for 30% off of this new sleek hardware wallet.
I hear you on that. I have a couple of questions. So one, I try to replay the genesis of the state in that early agrarian society with recourse to something like Bitcoin. And you don't have to, I guess, do that. You could say really anyone within one of these protection rackets, which would be any economic actor inside of a modern state, right? It's pay your taxes or we'll go to jail. It's the same theme as the early agrarian protection racket, just in a new wrapper.
Mm-hmm.
What does that game look like in a world with access to something like Bitcoin, though, where it's, if people are over extorted or overly expropriated from, then don't they start selling whatever else they have and moving into this wealth, or this, I don't want to call Bitcoin wealth, medium for preserving and moving purchasing power. You start to move some of your economic energy into this unassailable medium and then go somewhere else, right? Go to a jurisdiction that treats you better. Whatever, you get a lot of options all of a sudden, right? You can put the private key on your brain, cross a border with all your wealth in your mind, right? With all the plausible deniability that comes with. So I just wonder, like, if it almost calls into question the Genesis story, not calls into question, we would reinterpret the Genesis story of the state if economic actors had access to something like Bitcoin. So I wonder to what extent Bitcoin actually undermines the entire paradigm that we built ourselves on.
That's so cool. I don't know if you meant this, but you said we could reinterpret the Genesis story of the state. And I would say we reinterpret the Genesis story of the state with the Exodus story of the Bible. Okay? And I'm not a particularly religious man, but I do think the Exodus story is one of the greatest ever told by any human being. Yeah. And it's this idea of liberation through exit.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, when we leave a state of affairs that isn't working for us, perhaps to start something new, that creates a liberatory force. So when you talk about, like, what if you had Bitcoin back then in those early days, it's really saying, and I'm using the economist's term here of comparing something to transaction costs, right? The idea is to reduce transaction costs, that this facilitates cooperation and exchange, creating both individual value for all the participants in the arrangement, as well as an aggregate value, okay, for society. That's the idea of reducing transaction costs is something that economists love to play with. Yeah. Now, if you think about the idea of raising predation costs and reducing transaction costs, now you're talking about a different game theoretical set of optima.
Yes.
And that is a beautiful vision. It's a very systems thinking kind of masculine vision. Yeah. But when you start to talk about it in moral terms, in terms of being good and generous and map it onto our more universal moral sensibilities, then I think we start to paint a picture of the promise of Bitcoin, certainly, but also the promise of decentralizing power and finding all the means we possibly can to be more like bees and less like bears.
That's, I think, fantastically said, and I love the way Bitcoin is addressing it from both ends, right? Increasing the cost of predation, but also reducing transaction cost, or lowering the cost of cooperation, you might say. And so it's a very fundamental reshaping of the human incentive systems. And it's funny you mentioned the Bible, because that was actually my next question. And real quick on the story of Exodus, and I'm not a Bible expert either, but as I understand it, this is when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt into the desert.
Mm-hmm.
They wandered for 40 years. Then there's a lot of lessons there too, because initially they were sort of distraught. They had all this freedom, they had all this liberation, but they didn't know what to do with it. Many of them actually clamored for the tyranny again. They said, at least I was fed and I knew what to do. And so there's kind of this,
because they're in the desert.
Yeah. And anyways, great point. Like it's a very, probably one of the most profound stories of human liberation ever told, which is why it's in the biblical corpus. But the question I would ask is, we mentioned earlier, as a means of increasing the cost of predation, we have made strides, right? We have the rule of law. We have certain anti-theft technologies. I would say we even have developed kind of just morality itself, or ethics even, you might say. Like, it's not cool to steal someone's stuff. You'd get sort of socially frowned upon if you were caught doing it. Things like this prevent people from engaging in theft and other things like that.
Unless you're at a Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. And I'm not trying to, probably people call me racist or whatever for saying that, but like if you put a blanket of morality around bad behavior, it's as good as incentivizing it, and so we're seeing the ramifications of that around protest movements that involve violence and looting, and that's not good.
Yeah.
Agreed. Anyways, carry on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Agreed completely. And we have many justifications, right? We still think, obviously, printing money is theft, right? Inside of a legal monopoly, we justify that upside down in every direction, right? I saw something so insane today. Justin Trudeau threatening Canadian grocery stores because there's been price inflation in groceries. If they don't reduce their prices, he's going to impose additional taxation. It's like, only in clown world could the idea that the consequences of theft via inflation could be combated with theft via taxation. Like, it's just like, we're going to fix the theft with more theft. So I don't know, it twists the human mind into knots. And so, to your point on the Black Lives Matter protest, is like, all of a sudden, if this thing is socially, people are socially allowing it, it's weird how the mob mentality can kind of take over and you get really bad outcomes. So that's kind of an aside. The question I want to ask, though, so we have rule of law, we have anti-theft technologies, morality, ethics, et cetera, whatever, to enshrine or insulate this idea of private property, right? That each person gets to keep what they earn effectively. What is the role of religion? I would say specifically like Christ, this idea that we've promoted this guy to like the ultimate position of mythological hero. Does that play a role in kind of like steering our moral intuitions about what is right, what is wrong? Is it kind of like a social technology? I mean, that may sound like a bad way to frame it, but as just a means of getting people to play by a certain rule set that's not necessarily an incentive. It's not a carrot or a stick, right? It's just this story that's kind of permeated culture. Do you think that plays some role in guiding people's sort of moral intuitions about what's right and what's wrong, and preserving private property?
Absolutely. Like, it's the funniest thing. I'm tonight, I'm going to sit into a Christian men's reading group as like the only non-believer there, right? But I am interested in how Christians, through the lens of doctrine, seek to become better men, better fathers, better husbands, and so on, right? And because I want to see what patterns emerge in Christianity that map onto my own, and also my fiance is Jewish, right? So I'm learning a lot about Judaism just because it's like you can't help it, right? Our daughter is, because it's matrilineal, she's like de facto Jew, right? So now I got two Jews in my life, so I'm learning all this stuff. And what I'm finding is, I'm trying to answer your question in a way that it's not to say that Christianity as a religious hierarchy hasn't been terrible throughout human history. There's a lot of that. But I think at the end of the day, the way you interpret the Christian doctrine, one of the most important things that Jesus says is love thy neighbor as thyself, right? This is an echo of the same thing that you hear in almost every religious tradition around the world, instantiating in Sanskrit, it would be ahimsa, nonviolence, right? It's in a more extended version of that. It could be Hillel the Elder, the rabbi, who was purportedly stood on one foot and said, "Can you recite the entire to the goy? If you can recite the whole Torah on one foot, I'll convert to Judaism," right? And he stood on, purportedly, I guess, stood on one foot and said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." We see this over and as a moral subcultures somehow, in a good way, infects every single culture around the world. Technologies like Bitcoin just say, we're going to build that into the technology, which is a weird kind of thing to think about. But you don't want anybody taking your property. I mean, you can always go up to someone who has Bitcoin and hold a gun to their head and said, "Give me those private keys, 3, 2, 1, and, threaten to blow their brains out if they don't give you what's in there. So there's always a way for predators to act like predators. But when we raise those predation costs, that's awesome. But another way to raise predation costs is to bring back morality. So the weird way of answering your question is I don't think it has been a net good for society for people to abandon religious affiliation in this country in particular. So we've seen a diminishment, and I believe in some sense we've seen a diminishment of people using some variation of the golden rule to guide their lives. And instead they replace religion with politics, the church of state, right? And so what we see now is people replacing moral practice, like being compassionate to others that you see need help. We say we outsource our cares, our responsibilities to distant capitals, and we say, I pay my taxes and I'm obliging some distant bureaucrat to instantiate my morality for me. But then when you legislate morality, you lose the practice. You forget how to be good. And so, in answer to your question, I think the mythopoetic dimension of Jesus as peaceful being was extremely useful for the social order, even if I don't believe it theologically or doctrinally in other ways. I think it was basically the Judeo-Christian tradition, aspects of the I forgot the name, the blanket term for Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. They're related under umbrella of the Abrahamic religions, and then you have those three in Asia. Yeah. But all of them share these characteristics that are important to human social organization, happiness, harmony, and prosperity, basically.
Right. Which is arguably why they succeed, right? As they're nurturing this idea of individualism in a way, right? That gives us individual private property rights, the division of labor, peace and prosperity, effectively. I mean, who knows to say, I guess that's just me hypothesizing to say that's why they succeeded, but it seems to make sense, right? That the ideology which most promotes human flourishing tend to be the one that kind of wins out over time, or the ideologies. Now, obviously that's not true persistently, but over the longest arc of history seems to be somewhat true. And I agree with you strongly, actually, that when you take, in the US, for instance, like we've taken God largely out of the equation, but that creates some kind of, I don't know, ideological power vacuum. Like the way I consider it is that humans are almost like mythological creatures. Like we need to be plugged into some story, right? That's how it's how we accord ourselves. It's how we lower the cost of trust. Actually, I think there's an interesting parallel where Nick Szabo actually describes money as the trust minimized asset, right? The thing that you can use it, you need to trust people the least, right? If you give me the gold, I don't need to trust that you're going to do the thing. You paid me, so I'll go do the thing. And if you have a common morality, it's also more cost effective to establish trust, right? You're lowering the cost of interpersonal trust effectively. And so when you take that, you unplug God from the equation, you get this ideological power vacuum that is filled, you take out God and you get GOV basically. And all of a sudden are worshiping the state and, wearing
Peace to Balaji Srinivasan.
Yes. I think.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I have the question I have about this, and that's quite the rabbit hole to try and understand to what extent we are mythological creatures plugged into this distributed cultural fabric through story. That's a very interesting thing. To what extent do you think material incentives give rise to moral orders? Is it because, if you're a hunter and gatherer, well, it was moral to be the number one hunter killer in the group. That was like considered the apex of morality in that situation because you can win the most food for the clan or the tribe. Obviously, our moral intuitions have changed over time. To what extent is that a product of our changing technological realities or material incentives, in your opinion?
Yeah, these are all intertwined. So in The Social Singularity, which is the first book in a series of books that have this through line of decentralization, I talk about the interrelationships among let me see if I can remember them. It's this book came out in 2018, so it's been a while. But the idea here is we have rules, also called institutions, right? Now, those can be good rules or bad rules, depending on what the incentive system it creates, right? But rules create incentives, so we know that. We also have our genetics, who we are as human beings. We inherited basically being cavemen and women. We're Paleolithic creatures. We have Paleolithic brains. We can dress it up all day long, but we were evolved in a certain kind of state of affairs. And we have to acknowledge that, because I think to a very great degree, this is what can encourage predation. As we look out for tribe, it also creates egalitarian instincts in people. You ought to share, right? Because in a tribal situation, slow trade, if somebody gathered and somebody hunted, you need protein and you need carbohydrates. Sharing with the clan was at a sub Dunbar, below 150 people. That's what kept the clan alive. So there are different sort of moral sensibilities in those different contexts. And as we evolve through time, those change. So you have technological change, you have institutional change. You don't have much in the way of our Paleolithic brains change. So we have our evolution that maps onto all this stuff, or integrates with it in some way in like vacillating tandems. We have culture and we have morality. You might combine culture and morality, but essentially they can be decoupled. So if you have those 5 things and you think about how those things interrelate, it's you can't pull them apart. They're inextricably bound up with one another, and they create their own not only incentives, because sometimes incentives come out of morality or culture, right? So like, I love climate change. I mean, I love being a person who fights against climate change. I hate fossil fuels, right? That is what this theorist Rob Henderson calls luxury goods, right? In fossil fuels now, this idea of luxury goods is something that is like, it's, people of relative wealth like to hold a view because they don't see how it affects the poorest among us if it were instantiated, right? So it's a luxury good. Yeah. And luxury goods tend to replace Veblen goods, which is like, my big old, muscle car or whatever.
Yeah.
These days, to signal that you're an elite, you have to take on these sort of the luxury beliefs. And, fighting climate change is one of them.
Is it like?
Yeah, it's virtue signaling where the costs are borne primarily on the poor.
Right.
That's the twist. So yeah, it's like, we're constantly fighting these forms of irrationality that are baked into our brains. It's like, it is totally rational to be egalitarian sharers in a clan context. But when you scale to the level of society, you have to think about production and trade.
Right.
We weren't necessarily born to think about production and trade because when you're operating in clans, sub-Dunbar, it's a very different set of dynamics, economically speaking.
Right.
Shirking behavior, you have to punish shirking behavior. Everybody has to work. Everybody has to contribute, all that kind of stuff. It's very communist.
Yeah.
But communism works with less than 150 people.
Yes.
It's just when you try to scale it beyond that it goes to shit. You have to have production and exchange, sustainable patterns of production and exchange.
That's really well said. I love the inextricable knot you described between these things. Very much so. Like a technological paradigm can change incentives, but also the morality that may emerge from that can also be an incentive in and of itself, right? You may want to appear a certain way. You want to be trusted by someone, so you have an incentive to behave. Like a lot of, I guess this is how religion is passed down from parents to children often, is the children have an incentive. If they want the approval of their parents, well, they need to adhere to whatever the religious doctrine that their parent is pushing them towards. So I think you did a great job of describing this like complex system that we inhabit, and there's not linear causality. It's always feedback.
Yeah,
feedback.
I mean, and when you start to, intellectually or theoretically start to pull the thread out of the sweater, just encounter so many different aspects to this. It's like let's take Bitcoin again, because we love Bitcoin. I sure as heck love Bitcoin. I know you do. And what you get there is with time, the way it changes, a deflationary system changes time preference, right? You have Gresham's law phenomena and stuff like that are secondary effects, and we can talk about that if you want to at some point. But at the end of the day, the idea that Bitcoin can be a moral teacher is a really strange thing to think about. A lot of people say, oh, it's just an incentive system, or it's just a, store of value, or a medium of exchange, or it's this, or it's that, or it's a digital commodity. Bitcoin is a moral teacher. How about that? But it is, because the incentives shape our behavior.
Yes.
And this is why I was going back to the idea of moral practice. This is what I don't like. This is one of the big beefs I have with the Western ethical tradition, is it tends to be, and I love the Enlightenment. I'm a creature of the Enlightenment in my intellectual development, but I also know that there are limitations for Western ethics. It tends to be abstracted, like a rule that you pluck from the sky when you need to resolve some sort of ethical conundrum. No, this is what the Eastern practitioners can teach us, that it's about conscious, continuous practice in thought, word, and deed. You have to being good is the same as getting better at mixed martial arts, getting better at yoga, getting better at any other practice. You have to practice. You have to do it over and over again. You have to think about it. You have to talk about it, and you have to behave daily and reflect on that. That cultivates us as moral beings. when we outsource and this is what we were talking about earlier, when we outsource that to distant capitals, because, it's the church of state, and we think that compassion is outsourcing our responsibility for our fellow man to distant capitals and say, I pay my taxes and those rich people should pay more. We are absolving ourselves of that opportunity to practice to become better moral beings.
Yes.
So the incentive system of that the state creates is a lot of amorality, if not immorality. No, it's certainly immorality for political actors.
Yeah, certainly immoral. Well, to the extent that theft is immoral, the state is immoral, right? It's generating all of its revenues through theft. But further, I think to your point, it's also inculcating this perhaps immorality in taxpayers and the citizens that are just abdicating their responsibility, saying, I paid taxes, I did my duty, you figure it out. And that, again, for me here, there's a disconnect from truth, because you can't actually give up responsibility for yourself. Like, you're still going to have to be the one that puts 2 feet on the ground when you wake up in the morning and puts pant on one leg at a time and feeds yourself. Like, you have to own yourself in the world. Like, you are actually responsible for yourself. It doesn't matter what types of transactions you engage in, what type of institutions you sign up for. Like, you can't actually abdicate your responsibility, even though you may think you can. And so, and I love that you're framing that moral development as this constant, continuous process. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. It's actually, I think it's a principle for strategic living that the warrior sage Miyamoto Musashi, hope I'm saying his first name correctly, put forth. And he said that the way is in training. And the way in that, the East is like the Tao. It's the thing which you cannot speak. It's, like a divinity of sorts, I guess you would say. And he was saying that the way is in training. Like, it's constant preparation. Everything you do every day, you're preparing to live, you're preparing to fight, you're preparing to train, to love, to whatever it may be. And you have to just embrace that. And I don't know, for me, that particular quote gave a lot of meaning to all the monotony and all the suffering and all the hardships in life. It's like, oh, this is just part of the process. Like, you need to take in, it might be boring, you might not want to do it, it might be hard, but it's all part of that process of preparing to be better for the next time you encounter this situation, or a similar situation. And I just have to throw this in there too, because as you're describing what we're like, it reminded me of another one of my favorite quotes, that humans have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies, which is why we're so damn confused, I guess, in modern age.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, and look, we're warty creatures. It's like our genetics don't give a shit about our morality. It's they do to a degree. I think there are. I have to think about this in a lot of ways. I think they're genetic dispositions. There's a philosophical tradition called intuitionism, which means we kind of already know what's right and wrong. And I think there's some truth to that, but you'd have to see it through a Darwinian lens, right? Which is why we have in-group and out-group behavior that differs, right? Like it would be unthinkable to harm someone in your tribe, to be a predator to someone in tribe, because they contribute to the good of the tribe, right?
Right.
In a clan setting.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's like that tribe with the funny markings or the funny skin color or the funny eye color, or they're trying to, attack us and take our stuff so that they can survive. We have developed this, predilection to violence.
Yes.
And to be suspicious of difference. And that is not entirely an immoral way of looking at the world. In a certain context, we have to acknowledge that is absolutely the way. Otherwise, you're just going to get killed by another tribe who's going to come along and try to take your guinea fowl and your pigs and your women, right? And so and they're going to leave you dead to do so. So, I'm not sitting here saying we don't have to defend that part of this idea of sovereignty, which we haven't talked about yet, but sovereignty isn't about defense and retaliation. It must be, but that it must be violence must be put in its place. And the initiation of violence is what we have to resist in some sense, if we want to create a moral order and find others who are willing to suspend the initiation of violence and accept a moral order, a similar moral order. That is the basis of a new civilization, at least one I think you and I would hope to see. But there's no doubt we have to defend ourselves. There's no doubt we have to go to war. And as the warrior monk you spoke about, the Japanese warrior monk said, we have to always be training in this regard.
Yes.
There's a holiness. We have to sacralize that. So in all the ways we can train to become more virtuous and more excellent, we have to sacralize that too. And centralization saps us of that.
Right.
It desacralizes it. It makes us, I don't know, shittier, and it shows.
Yeah, the book, The Sovereign Individual, it talks often calling it the nanny nation state, and describes how it's infantilizing people, right? It's like, I think, I don't need to worry about my health care or my social security or my retirement. I just keep paying into this government funded, subsidized program, and I'm taken care of, and I vote for the guy, and I don't need to have an opinion on different things. It's like again, that person is not facing up to the realities of being like an adult in the world. They're just kind of abdicating all of this to another institution.
Well, and with money, it's like the Keynesians. It's funny how the Keynesians are always simultaneously have embraced this sort of clown world economic doctrine, right?
Right.
And on the other, they tend also to be anti-capitalist in a way, or anti-consumerist. And it's like, you can't hold both of these in juxtaposition for too long without recognizing the contradiction, because Keynesianism is based on consumption.
Yes.
Right? Whereas Say's law in Austrian economics is about thrift and savings.
Yeah.
It's not to say you won't ever consume,
right,
but the incentives are to save and be thrifty and not eat the seed corn. And the Keynesians are like, eat the seed corn, eat the seed corn.
Yes.
And I'm like, no. I'm sure that there are a million economists out there going, you don't know what you're talking about. We have a PhD in all these mathematical models and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, you're in the incentive systems that you're creating make us more consumerist, more interested in debt spending. And of course, the adulteration of our money contributes to that in great measure.
Absolutely. And it's basically a pseudoscience that's intended to justify the monopolization and printing of money, basically.
Yeah.
And all of the mental gymnastics to get there are just truly mind-boggling. Not only are they telling you to eat the seed corn, but, when the economy goes into recession, they will print more money so you can buy more seed corn to get the economy started again. It's really, really bizarre. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Wasabi Wallet. With Wasabi Wallet, you can receive, send, and store Bitcoin privately. In Wasabi Wallet, your transaction history and wallet balance are completely hidden. Wasabi Wallet is easy to use, all of its privacy features are built in by default, and it works with any amount of Bitcoin. Wasabi users can make CoinJoin transactions together with BTC Pay server users or Trezor Suite users. For BTC Pay server users, they can make payments directly inside of a CoinJoin, and for Trezor Suite users, you can make CoinJoins directly on a hardware wallet. These features result in fee savings and security improvements for both sets of users. So go to wasabiwallet.io today to download the state-of-the-art Bitcoin privacy wallet. Okay, so last time we met on here, we were kind of outlining this conversation, and I think you brought up something that I wanted to talk about. You mentioned Alexander Bard's notion of narratology.
And
I wondered I actually don't know. I know nothing about this. I know who Mr. Bard is. I've spoken to him once. I have not talked to him about narratology. So I'm just wondering, what is narratology, and how does that fit into what we've been discussing today? I guess in particular as it relates to mythology and guiding human moral intuitions, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bastardize anything that Bard says, and he's a Swedish guy, and we've developed a personal correspondence via email, and I've very much enjoyed becoming friends with him. I'm much more radical in, I guess, in my anarchy than he is, and he's much more European in his philosophical training than I. But that invites really interesting discussion and exchange. But when you go back to this sort of I think 4 Greek words: pathos, ethos, logos, and
Mythos.
Mythos. Yeah. Yes. You have, again, really interesting interplay between all those. And so how those interplay, specifically on with mythos being, or the mythopoetic dimension being a part of narratology is sort of like the study of how we tell stories about ourselves and how we understand ourselves through that lens. So it really focuses on the interplay, but specifically mythos, I think, and pathos.
Can we find those real quick? I always get them.
Yeah.
Logos is sort of like intellect. Pathos is emotion. Ethos is something like ethics, or
it's more like this one I get sort of different definitions of. Ethos also is what binds us as a community. So the ethical dimension of ethos is like, ethics is something that we would share in order to form community, but it's this like communitarian idea, what makes us us.
Gotcha.
Is ethos. And then what was the fourth one? Was mythos.
Is emotion, right? Pathos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Logos is kind of like intellect. Obviously, logos is a very deep term. And then mythos, that's a real mysterious one to me. It's kind of like, as you said, mythopoetic. It's sort of the narrativizing maybe of the 3 of those into one thing.
I think Bard wouldn't get mad at me too much for that description. So when you think about if we go back to Underthrow, you open the conversation asking about Underthrow and talking about, I really think this is Underthrow has a lot of logos in. Philosopher by training, and I make arguments, but I will say that I understand the importance of narrative. If Bard's narratology is how to do that better, then I'm trying to be a better practitioner of narratology. Specifically, we have a set of stories about what America is and how it's created. It has its own origin story, and most of the time, that goes back to 2 events, right? I mean, there's the Pilgrims and all that stuff, which is like the proto-republic. But like the 2 big titanic things are 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and 1789, the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, right? The ratification. So if we take those 2 events as sort of like the best origin story, they're kind of at odds, all right? The Constitution, while a masterful piece of law, a document that instantiated the first democratic republic, it is a masterpiece. It is wonderful. And bringing the world out of these predatory hierarchies, right? But I want to argue that it's insufficient. And what most people do, especially conservative Americans, is to sacralize it to the. If you want to change it, you got to go through the amendment process. It's like, well, that you're locking us in politics as a means of making social change. All right. So I want to go back to that in just a moment, but So the sacralization, and I think it's necessary. And if in fact we see a revival of the original intent of the Constitution in those terms by good old patriotic Americans sacralizing it the way they have, if we're able to achieve a revival of that with the original intent, I think that's a good thing. Don't get me wrong. But what I see is that even the subtle imperfections of the U.S. Constitution have given rise to the things that the anti-federalists worried about, that they warned us about. Jefferson said, don't do this. Robert Yates said, don't do this. There were a bunch more of these anti-federalists who said, okay, you better at least put this Bill of Rights on here or you're going to be in trouble. You're centralizing authority too much, and that makes mischief, right? This, boy, as it has. The Commerce Clause has been interpreted in a way that has created a lot of problems. There are other imperfections, if you like, based on our moral core that we've been discussing, that have given rise to what is essentially the American empire, right? And it could be that there were going to be inevitable cycles of rise and fall of empires anyway, because that's just what happens based on human nature, based on what's in us all the time. But that doesn't mean, but whatever the case, we might need a reboot, okay? We might need an upgrade, taking the best of the Constitution that we have. And I try to do that by appeal to the Declaration story, the Jeffersonian concept of the consent of the governed. We've been talking about consent this whole time. So the consent of the governed, we got to return to that. There is not enough consent of the governed in the Constitution. And that consent of the governed, if government becomes, I'm paraphrasing here, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but in the Declaration it says, if government becomes destructive of these ends, namely to protect our rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and this idea that we are entitled to give consent to government, then we have a right to abolish it and create something new. We have a right to exit and recreate. So I'm trying to appeal to that as a mechanism of saying, yes, the Constitution is sacred, but it ain't that damn sacred. And all these predators out here are squatting on top of it and keeping power because we're not even able to get back to original intent. And so what would it look like? Let's move the mental Overton window. What would it look like to reconstitute a civilization based on the consent of the governed, which is another sacralized origin story that we have, as we should. And that's kind of why I was doing that. And that's why we're doing the contest too, the $25,000 Constitution of Consent contest.
Yeah, I want you to mention the contest. I think it's important for my audience here. And then last question on that thread.
Okay.
Did we do ourselves a major disservice by swapping out the pursuit of happiness from, it was inviolable property in the Magna Carta in 1215, and we swapped out inviolable private property. We inserted the pursuit of happiness. Was that a mistake?
Yeah, we went from Locke to Jefferson on that. I think probably so. I think in the Bill of Rights, there should have been something about property. There should have been something about property in the Bill of Rights and the inviolability of property, probably. And I also think that in the Declaration, was it a mistake in the sense of, I think this is a really good question, Robert, and I don't know quite how to answer it, because in one sense, the Declaration is not considered a charter document in the same way that the Constitution is. If we did consider it a charter document in the same way Constitution is, then we would have a very different looking law and all the incentives that are given. What we do have, however, is the sacralization of the Constitution And the Declaration is sort of like an artifact of the revolution that got us there, but it kind of stops there. It no longer serves as this moral and legal substrate. And that's why I'm trying to appeal to people's patriotism to say a new constitution might be in order, or take the old constitution we have, restructure it based on stronger considerations about property rights, for example. So I think, yeah, maybe was a mistake to replace property with the pursuit of happiness. I would like to see both, because I think both are important concepts. So if they said life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, that would have been a mouthful and a laundry list, but it would have done a really good job, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, please tell us about this contest that you're running, and I think my audience might be interested in applying.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is promotion of the Constitution of Consent contest. We're giving $25,000. Yes, it's fiat. Yes, its purchasing power is going down by the minute, but it's still a lot of money. And the idea is to come up with a novel constitution that creates a consent-based order based on that Jeffersonian notion. I have about 25 guidelines in there, but the winner will get $20,000. Second place will get $3,000. Third place will get $2,000. And the idea here is, give us your best constitution that will realize the concepts that you and I have been talking about in this very episode. If you can do that, and we're going to have constitutional scholars looking at this, on our judges, we'll give you a whole bunch of money, because we really want, if nothing else, to change our mental frameworks back to this idea of a moral order based on a moral core. And then from there, hey, we may even start to try to figure out how to instantiate it. The funder of this contest, the guy who contributed the initial money to the contest, really wants to try to see it instantiated in some way, even if it's like, Prospera in Honduras is like,
right,
2 square miles of land somewhere, but they adopt this. There has at the very least symbolic value, if not, given somebody the opportunity to exit a bad state of affairs. And I'm afraid our empire is crumbling, and it's certainly top heavy, and it may crumble soon. So creating niches or exit hatches is the idea, and the Constitution of Consent contest sort of opens people's mind to this possibility.
That is super cool. I'm really glad you're doing that, and I'm excited to hear how it goes.
Yeah, it's underthrow.org.
Okay.
Yeah, underthrow.org. That's my Substack. You just subscribe to the Substack. If you no longer want to enter the contest and you don't like what I write, you don't have to stay subscribed, obviously, but that'll give you reminders, and you can find the contest in the nav bar at underthrow.org.
That's awesome. You actually front run my last question. I was going to say, where can people find you on the internet? But I guess it's underthrow.org.
Yes, sir.
Anything else you want to plug there before we wrap up? And we'll also put everything in the show notes.
I'd love to sell people a little ebook. I keep it, price is cheap. I don't try to profit from it. I profit from knowing that more people have eyeballs on it. So Underthrow, the book, is certainly something I'd love to put in people's hands. And I really want Bitcoin crazies to enter this Constitution of Consent contest at underthrow.org, because they get it. Bitcoiners get it. They get the idea of decentralization, and they can extrapolate that concept to the entire socio-political order.
Sounds great. Max, really appreciate you doing this. We didn't cover everything, so we're going to have you back on soon, but really appreciate it.
Oh, man, it'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.